একটু মিউট করে দেন তাহলে ওই একোটা হবে না, that would be better. তো
ইত্যাদি আমাকে ফোন করছে, কথা বলবো।
So I'm very happy that we have among us today a very esteemed colleague of ours, Soumik Nandy Majumdar. He's from Kala Bhavan. I welcome you all. I welcome Soumik for having agreed to come and talk to us. I now request my young colleague Partho to introduce Soumik. Partho?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Bipashadi. Namaskar and good afternoon to everyone. It's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Soumik Nandy Majumdar. He is a faculty member in the Department of History of Art at Kala Bhavan, Visva-Bharati, Shantiniketan. He graduated from Visva-Bharati and completed his master's from Baroda, both in History of Art. Apart from researching and writing on modern art of Bengal, and especially on the art of Shantiniketan, he has researched extensively on visual appreciation vis-a-vis visual pedagogy. Dr. Majumdar received his PhD on visual literacy for school children from Visva-Bharati University. He has published articles and essays in various national and international journals and magazines. He has contributed as an art critic to several catalogs of contemporary art shows. He has 2 books on art appreciation in Bangla to his credit. He has also taught as visiting faculty at reputed institutions like NIT, Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar, Vijayawada, IIT, Kanpur, FTII, Pune, and SRFTI, Kolkata. As I mentioned earlier, Soumik did his PhD on visual literacy for school children. This sort of directly connects us to today's talk entitled Retelling Art Through the Eyes of Children. Just a few days ago, I was teaching some of my students a certain part from R.K. Lakshman's autobiography, where he talks about his childhood experience of looking at the world through some broken pieces of colored glass, and how that experience shaped his future art. I'm quite sure that today's presentation by Soumik is going to be interesting and thought-provoking. So let me ask Soumik to take over. Soumik, please.
Thank you, Partho. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are.
And thank you, Bipashadi, for having me on board. And I must appreciate this Visva-Bharati Young Scholars Lecture Series initiative, and very meaningfully titled as Dialogic. And this is precisely what we want, all of us, within academics and outside. We want to have more and more opportunities to have dialogues and interactions. And my presentation, let me call it a presentation. It's more than a lecture. It should be a presentation where I'll be using a PowerPoint presentation. And through a series of images, I would try to share partially, since it's an incredibly vast subject, so it has to be partial, I'm afraid. But still, I would like to share with you a glimpse of some of the findings, some of my observations regarding what Partho just mentioned, visual literacy, and mainly in the context of children, school children. And of course, this has been a very old interest of mine from my college days, when I used to observe how children would have an incredibly different view of life and the visual experiences and facts around them. And they would try their best to express their responses to the visual world around them through their art, through their paintings, sculptures, and in various forms. And of course, other forms of expressions, not just visual art, but different, but definitely through writings, poetries, etc. But being a student of art and especially of art history, I was more interested in looking at what kind of expressions they were coming up through their art. So primarily, I was looking at what is generally known as, for the want of better word, child art, as a very interesting area to research and study. But eventually, I was drawn to another aspect, hitherto unknown to me, that is how children, apart from being artists themselves, are also very interesting viewers of art of not only by themselves, but art of anybody, any artist across the world. So this is one aspect which I kind of discovered rather accidentally when later, when I came back from Baroda, and after a couple of years when I started teaching also here in Kala Bhavan, and I used to once in a while kind of have some good time with kids in my own locality here in Shimantupolli, and some children would come to my house, and I would say I used to teach art, but we used to kind of draw and paint together, and often they would pick up an art book from my shelf and would start looking at them, leaving aside their art. And then I got interested, and I kind of very carefully, I started actually, I began to observe that how exactly they were responding to different artworks, be it by Paul Klee or Abanindranath Thakur or Jamini Rai or Van Gogh or Rabindranath Thakur, anybody for that matter. I was more interested in their, what we now we have more formal terminologies like visual literacy and all that. But I was basically trying to study their visual response to other arts and art forms. So this is one, rather a major part of my presentation today. And this also formed a major part of my PhD work. Now, but it is also very important to acknowledge, and we do acknowledge, we all parents and teachers, we do acknowledge that as artists, and because primarily, and let me share my screen to my PowerPoint. Yes. I hope it is visible.
Yes.
Now, we appreciate children as far as their visual literacy is concerned and visual ability and the creativity is concerned primarily as artists. And there are reasons, of course, we all know that. For example, I just couldn't resist the temptation of sharing this wonderful experience of mine when I went to a very remote village in Bangladesh, in Khulna district, in a very remote village in Bagherhat. And there I came across this young girl. She was 6 years old, perhaps, and she did not have, really speaking, any habit, any opportunity to draw or paint. In fact, in the photograph, the small little sketchbook that you see belonged to me, the pen belonged to me. I also offered her some colored pencils, and she started actually copying some of those images that you see on the left-hand side from a book which was given to her from her school. And I thought, after looking at these images, that you can see a mosque, you can see a parrot and bird and all that, and a hen. And I thought that she did have the habit of doing some drawings and paintings. But when I asked her mother, and when I in fact asked her, she said no. Usually she doesn't draw pen, and her mother also said no. There is no such habit here. Perhaps that was the first time she was doing so many drawings, and that too because of my presence, and I kind of encouraged her to do. And so there are plenty of such incidents we do come across in our life where we see that children do come up with some extraordinary evidences of their imaginations, of their capacity to express visually, so on and so forth. And through their art, we also get to know that how great observers they are generally. Their observation capacity is just beyond anything. And we have seen that despite the so-called disproportions and anatomical distortions and all that, in most of the drawings and paintings, we do find fantastic evidences of their power of observation. And so they make us see the way they see the world, and they also make us see the way they see themselves. For example, when that same girl, Taslim, when she said, when I asked her, can you draw yourself? Can you paint yourself? She said, yes. And she showed me these two paintings, and which she did on her exercise book, which she was not supposed to do. But anyway, she did that. And when I just kind of encouraged her, when I told her, wow, these two girls exactly look like you. And she said, no, of course not. They don't look like me. They are me, but they don't look like me. Then she said, who are they? Then she said, these two are my two very favorite dolls that I have. I told her, but I asked you to draw yourself. Then she said, yes, they are me, but they are not me. I mean, I was quite surprised the way she was kind of trying to explain that these two very favorite dolls actually represent her. And on the other hand, I was kind of expecting that she would draw herself. So, I mean, I can go on telling innumerable such stories, which I have experienced over a long period of time when I and I guess it's not only me, there are many such people, teachers, parents, who can do the same. But the moment I kind of, so many years back, I'm talking about those early days, when I started looking at child art with a slightly different viewpoint, mainly to gauge, to measure, to understand their capacity as the observer, how well they actually do observe their world around, despite their representational simplicity and all that. I also observe the accuracy of the observations. For example, when you look at this painting of a bazaar, the small little market, each and every vegetable is actually recognizable. So there is sense of recognition, sense of observation, the accuracy, and a certain kind of representation, which may or may not conform to our, the adults' expectations, is something that goes on and keeps developing, as we all know. Now, this is by a much younger, probably he was 5 years old, 4 years old at that point of time. And this boy was extremely interested in microscopic organisms. I mean, like very small little insects. And his whole, at that point of time, most of the paintings and drawings that he was doing would be kind of huge enlargement of the tiniest creatures of the world. I mean, some of these examples, these very, very brief 2-3 examples, can also open up the possibility to study the observational power of children. And in my case, my interest was also to relate this observation to their viewing of art, not children as artists, but children as art viewers, as onlookers. Now, if this photograph is shown, where you can see not the full figures of the children, but plenty of hands, extremely agitated hands, doing some scribbles, which is something very common, very usual. A lot of kids do that. But there is a context of this particular photograph. In fact, here you see children, not exactly as very independent artists, but as onlookers. And in fact, in this particular painting, they were responding to a work of art which I had shown just 5 minutes back, a painting by Jackson Pollock. And I deliberately I showed them because just prior to this, it was a session. It was a particular session with some 10, 15 children, and where I was supposed to show a lot of images and they were supposed to respond to them. And after having shown images with clear, recognizable features, I just thought, okay, let me try this out. Let me show them something which is quote unquote abstract, where nothing is recognizable. So let me see how do they respond. And the first thing they asked me, who is the artist? They were quite flabbergasted, quite taken aback when they saw this painting. I told them, this is by one American painter called Jackson Pollock. And the next response was, can we do a Pollock ourselves? I said, yes, why not? And that was the result. This is what they started doing. And unfortunately, I do not have the photograph of the finished painting, but they went on and they were on it for next 15-20 minutes. They completed the whole painting and they were extremely happy. And I was quite surprised, shocked, because until I showed Pollock, most of those images that I was showing them, I will show you some of those images right now. Most of the questions they were asking me, the inquiries they had, was, what is that? Who is this? What about that figure? Who is this man? Who is this woman? Because you see that the desperate attempt to recognize, to identify the features, to identify the forms is pretty natural among them. So I thought probably this, they will be quite shocked to see Jackson Pollock, but no, on the contrary, they were extremely happy to see a painting where there is not a single element which they could recognize, identify, and they kind of, as if they immediately got to know that, well, this is a painting they're looking at where identifying or recognizing anything is not what would matter. They were responding to it exactly the way perhaps the artist himself was doing this painting, with that full gusto, that full energy. So I was going through some of these experiences. For example, this young boy who was visiting Shantiniketan, and this was just around that time when Kala Bhavan was having its centenary, and we had put up a show at Nandan Gallery in Kala Bhavan. And I was kind of accompanying him. And when I brought him in front of this sculpture, and I asked him, and he was making faces, in fact. I said, what exactly you're trying to do? He said, no, I'm trying to imitate that person, that man over there, which is on the pedestal. Then I said, okay, let me take a photograph. Then he said, no, then let me change my expression. I said, why? Then he said that because we are two different people, we cannot actually have the same expression. Though when I was looking away, then he was trying to imitate. And when I was trying to take a photograph of him in front of that sculpture, he was trying to put up an expression which is exactly opposite to the expression that apparently that man on the sculpture was having. Now, what is important here, or in this kind of cases, is that in more often than not, I have seen on several occasions, the children not only look at a work of art, not only just see them, but they begin to interact with the works of art in various ways. And eventually, I was drawn to a very, very exciting aspect of my research, that, okay, children do respond to works of art. They do interact with works of art in various ways. But how do they express that interactions? I mean, how do they express the responses? Now, as you just saw in the previous image, this is one way of expressing the responses. This is how they would make their responses felt, not verbally necessarily, not by explaining the responses, but by simply doing another work of art, kind of resonating the work of art they have just responded to. In this case, this young boy, as far as this particular sculpture is concerned, he was continuously trying to kind of mimic that, going for a kind of mimicry. Okay, fine. And in that same exhibition, there was this very rare and a wonderful painting by Ramkinkar Bej. And as you can see from the photography itself, there's a great impact of impasto. The surface is pretty projected, it is raised, and there's a lot of impasto treatment. It's not a very plain surface. And probably this boy, he quickly responded to that. He reacted to that. And given his short height, this painting was obviously above his eye level. And he asked me several times, can you lift me up? I want to see the painting properly. And every time I was lifting him up, asking him to see the painting at his eye level, I was undergoing some shock because he was trying to touch the painting, which he was not doing with any other work of art, any other painting or drawing. And I had to kind of scold him. I had to tell him, what the hell are you trying to do? He said, I want to scratch the painting. I want to touch the painting. I mean, so then I realized that he was actually responding to the extremely tactile quality of this painting, which it is. So on a more personal note, while observing various such moments where and when children seem to be responding to various works of art, either in original or in reproduction, often also on projected images or real images, not just as passive viewers, but as active viewers, interacting with the works of art, responding to the works of art, and very importantly, interpreting the works of art. I have never come across so far a single child who doesn't make any attempt at interpreting a work of art. And they don't care whether that interpretation matches with the original or intended meaning or not. But interestingly, more often than not, their candid interpretations often come very close to the intended meanings and also provide the new possibilities of looking at a work of art. And this is precisely what I have been trying to do for more than a decade. In fact, that looking at the possibility of rewriting briefly the history of art through the eyes of children. Now, of course, it is not at all a very new idea or a novel idea, because then when I came across a number of titles published from English-speaking countries, mainly USA and England, the only foreign language that I know. And also I heard that, and I've been told by my European friends that there are books also in French, in Japanese, in also maybe other European languages, where authors are trying to write books on art from the point of view of children. So I found it very interesting that, okay, this is not a very unique experience of mine. This is a pretty universal experience, but it's important that we pay attention to it and take it seriously. Now, let me go back to many years back. In fact, this is a small little clay, as you can see, sun-baked clay, kind of a doll, a figurine, which I just chanced upon when I was walking through the Pearson Polly, just next to Shikha Bhavan buildings. And I saw a couple of kids with lumps of clay seated there and making some figures and all that. And this is one piece which was lying in the sun. I picked it up and I was very young, just pass out. I have just come back from Baroda after completing my master's, full of art history from head to toe. So obviously I was looking at it from an art history angle and I thought, wow, this exactly, I mean, if not exactly, but very closely it resembles many of those terracotta figurines we often see in Indus Valley civilization. They're like mother goddess and all that. So I was pretty confident that these figurines should ideally be representing all those figures, mother goddesses, some kind of ritual figures. So I asked one of those boys that, okay, I know this should be one of your gods or goddesses, some deity. Then he said, what deity? I said, no, Bhagavan. They said, no, Bhagavan. He said, what? This is Akshay Kumar. Now, I was quite taken aback, but again, coming back to the way a child looks at a form, because I was conditioned to look this kind of what Stella Crumlish calls ageless types of terracotta figures from a particular art historical perspective. And this boy gives me an entirely new, not only new, a contemporary interpretation or identity to this image, because what he had in his mind was a very popular Hindi film hero, Akshay Kumar. And he thought that, can't you see? Can't you see? This is Akshay Kumar. So I mean, that sentence still rings in my mind. Can't you see? So we need to see from their point of view as well, which we often miss out. So because you see, these are the figures that I was remembering, and this is what he was doing just a few years back. So my the whole chronological structure of art history, the way I had studied so far, was kind of challenged by this kind of interpretations. And as I progressed, I carried on with my research work. I came across plenty of such incidents where my formal, official art history knowledge got challenged every now and then. So it was kind of a process of unpacking certain conditioned art historical knowledge, and also, more importantly, a way of knowing how children respond to visuals. Visuals as in visual art, and visuals as in visual experiences around the natural experience, the social experience, and all that. Now, what Rabindranath very aptly called Dhaka in one of his brilliant small little essays, which he had read out in one of those I think it used to be, of course, in one of those regular mandirs, I think, in the Prarthana Griho, way back, almost 100 years back, between 1908 and 1916. So this Dhaka, and particularly when this Dhaka, this looking at, the seeing happens from children, by children, this entails not only new interpretations, but it invites new stories. A lot of new narratives seem to be emerging every time when I interacted with children on these occasions. For example, this is a wonderful story that I'm remembering, that when I showed this piece of painting, very famously known as Starry Night by Van Gogh. And unfortunately, I do not have right now the photograph of the painting that she did in response to this art. And she told me in the beginning that she would like to make a copy of this painting because she fell in love with this painting. I said, okay, yes, go ahead. Now, when she showed me her painting, it was not exactly a copy because all these very starry and agitated stars in the sky is completely missing. It's a very calm and a very silent, very peaceful sky. And the trees also happen to be very peaceful. I thought it was a part of his drawing or her drawing or her inability to exactly copy that. Then, but still I had to ask her that what happened to those agitating stars, those beautiful sparkling stars. She said that the stars have gone to sleep. I asked her why. She said, Van Gogh has gone to sleep too. So she gave a new interpretation that once Van Gogh had finished this painting and he returned back, the stars also became very peaceful, very calm, and they stopped being kind of in such an agitating form anymore. So I asked her why it is like that. She said, it's because the sky happens to be like this only when Van Gogh looks at the sky. If he stops looking at the sky comes back to its normal stage, not like this. So she said something like that, which she, of course, obviously, which she was not quoting anybody or she hadn't read anywhere. It was completely her imagination. But I also felt at that point of time that, well, here is also a scope to take children seriously as art viewers, not just as art makers. But even when we consider them as artists, there also we are almost bound to make mistakes. And I can't again resist the temptation of reading out a few lines from a wonderful poem titled Chobi Aankiye. It is there in Chitro Bichitro compilation by Rabindranath Tagore. And he did observe that it is basically the shortcoming of the adults who fail to read the interpretations, the meanings, and the huge possibilities the child art actually offers. So, let me read it out. It's in Bengali. The very first, I'm not going to read out the entire poem. Let me read out the first paragraph where the poet clearly points out that there is a terrible shortcoming on part of the adults to read, to see properly what a child actually can express in their art. ছেঁড়া খোড়া মোর পুরনো পাতায় ছবি আঁকি আমি যা আসে মাথায় যখনই ছুটি পাই বঙ্কিম মামা বুঝিতে পারে না বলে যে কিছুই যায় না তো চেনা বলে কি হয়েছে ছাই আমি সরি একটা বোধহয় না ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডে আওয়াজ আসছে
করে দাও একদম পুরো ঠিক করে নাও ওদিকে বলো যে প্রহ্লাদের সঙ্গে একটু দেখা করবে
গৌতম মন্ডল could you please put yourself on mute গৌতম
দিলাম গৌতম দাকে মিউট করে দিলাম
থ্যাংক ইউ আরেকবার পড়ছি চট করে ছেঁড়া খোড়া মোর পুরনো খাতায় ছবি আঁকি আমি যা আসে মাথায় যখনই ছুটি পায় বঙ্কিম মামা বুঝিতে পারে না বলে যে কিছুই যায় না তো চেনা বলে কি হয়েছে ছাই তারপরে obviously এটা বাচ্চাটির ভাষায় লেখা তার দিক থেকে। আমি বলি তারে, এই তো ভালুক, এই দেখো কালো বাঁদরের মুখ, এই দেখো লাল ঘোড়া, রাজপুত্তুর কাল ভোর হলে দণ্ডক বনে যাবেন যে চলে, রথে হবে ওরে জোড়া। উঁচু হয়ে আছে এই পাহাড়, খোঁচা খোঁচা ঘায়, ওঠে বাঁশঝাড়, হেতা সিংহের ভাষা। এঁকে বেঁকে দেখো এই নদী চলে, নৌকো এঁকেছি ভেসে যায় জলে, ডাঙা দিয়ে যায় চাষা। সাদা কাগজের চর করে ধুধু, সাদা হাঁস দুটো বসে আছে শুধু, কেউ কোথাও নেই। So apparently the kid is continuously weaving stories, layers and layers of story based on a painting which perhaps doesn't contain so many elements, but he can see what an adult cannot see. So he goes on, গোল করে আঁকা, এই দেখো দেখি সূর্যের ছবি ঠিক হয়নি কি, মেঘ এই দাগ যত। So these are the dag, these are the marks which are supposed to represent Megh, cloud, and that is the Surjo. And then he, in fact, Rabindranath Tagore, he writes a stunning line here. শুধু কালি লেপা দেখিছো এই পাতে, আঁধার হয়েছে এই খানটাতে, ঠিক সন্ধ্যার মতো। And what this kid's father tells him at the end of the poem, when this particular kid is completely frustrated, that despite all his attempts to explain and describe what all there in this painting, his mama fails to see them. So his father says, ছবি দেখিতে কি পায় সব লোকে, দোষ আছে তোর মামারই দু চোখে, বাবা এই কথা বলে। So I was aware of this possible shortcomings on my part as well, and therefore it required a prolonged study. And therefore, when I was talking about different kinds of responses, I still remember, and it happened, in fact, this recurred later, even after many years later, particularly for very young children who were not so kind of articulate in their expressions or in their responses, could actually once again imitate and express what exactly they can see in this painting of a weeping woman, very famous painting by Picasso. So what later on I learned from books written by very important American scholars who worked on visual literacy of children, that the possibility of, we should not, in fact, she repeatedly warns us that we should not ignore the possibility of non-verbal response. Now that is one problem that I had faced, and I learned very quickly how to overcome that, because usually we expect the children to respond verbally, to articulate. But there lies this whole possibility where the children may not like to respond verbally, and they go for non-verbal response, which we adults do not usually do, unless we are a performer. For example, I've seen a wonderful performance by Astad Debu, who passed away recently in Mumbai, in response to a solo show by Jayashree Chakraborty, who also happens to be a very senior, quite many years senior to me, alumni of Kala Bhavan. So these are very special occasions when an adult is actually planning a particular response through a different form, like Astad Debu did. He performed, he did a choreography. But in case of children, these are absolutely spontaneous responses, right? Now, before I move on to some other visuals, just let me tell you that beside showing well-known works of art, Indian, Western, etc., on many occasions, I've also tried out by showing non-English or non-Bengali or non-Hindi cartoons or comics like this, a Chinese comics. And just I wanted to see how children, since they do not follow Chinese, how would they directly respond to the visual? And of course, in almost all the cases, they responded absolutely with great amount of accuracy. Exactly. For example, I remember that when I showed this particular Chinese cartoon, and immediately in one class, in fact, in our Pathu, Shantiniketan Pathu, I was showing this many years back, and that I think it was a class 5 children from a particular section of class 5, and almost collectively, all of them, all together, they, as if they found out the answer to this picture, and they said, yes, the parent and the student alike facing the same burden of education and a kind of porashunar chap, they said, I still remember. Baba chele dujone chape ache, porashunar chape ache. And this is exactly what this particular cartoon was all about. Now, since I would also like to, if this is the second section of my presentation, I would like to share some of my experiences with children, and particularly children of Shantiniketan, Pathu Bhavan, and also some children elsewhere, like in Kolkata Pathu Bhavan also, where I have studied, that there was a project, a wonderful project that I received from a very close friend of ours, Shormishta Dattagupta. At that point of, she was planning a whole series of books on how to teach or make Tagore, make Rabindranath Tagore as a painter, as a poet, as a playwright, more accessible to school children. And though I have been looking at children also from the point of view as onlookers, as viewers of art, but I was, most of those occasions were rather sporadic or incidental. It was not taking a very systematic shape. But thanks to Shormishta, now I got almost like a project that I need to go through this for a period of time, like 9 to 10 months. And for this particular project, it was Rabindranath Tagore's paintings. And my job was to show Rabindranath Tagore's paintings to school children, like Pathu Bhavan of Shantiniketan, Pathu Bhavan of Kolkata, then Shuchona in Khanjanpur, and some other schools in and around Birbhum, both rural and urban schools. Now, what I did with Rabindranath Tagore's paintings could also be done with many other paintings, and I did that eventually later on. But it was quite a few years later, after I did this series of sessions with children, showing them Rabindranath's paintings, much later I came across that essay that I was referring to, that essay called Dhaka by Rabindranath. Once again, after, you see, I have not come across, of course, later on, Nandalal very clearly emphasizes on the importance and significance of introducing visual education, not only as in art making, but also as art looking. But quite a few years before that, when Rabindranath, in this particular essay called Dhaka, keeps on emphasizing on this very, very important aspect of Dhaka as, of course, not as a habitual Dhaka, not as a habitual way of looking, but as a more conscious way of looking. And because he says, to quote, that Alo কেবল একটি মাত্র কথা প্রতিদিন আমাদের বলছে, দেখো, ব্যাস, একবার চেয়ে দেখো, আর কিছুই না. Then he writes, আমরা চোখ মেলি, আমরা দেখি, কিন্তু সেই দেখাটুকু দেখার একটা কুঁড়ি মাত্র, এখনো তা অন্ধ। সেই দেখায় দেখার সমস্ত ফসল ধরবার মতো স্বর্গাভিগামী সৃষ্টি এখনো ধরেনি, বিকশিত দেখা এখনো হয়নি, ভরপুর দেখা এখনো হয়নি। তবু রোজ সকালবেলায় বহু যোজন দূর থেকে আলো এসে বলছে, দেখো, সেই যে একই মন্ত্র রোজই আমাদের কানে উচ্চারণ করে যাচ্ছে, তার মধ্যে একটা অশ্রান্ত আশ্বাস প্রচ্ছন্ন হয়ে রয়েছে। Now, what is interesting that even almost around this time, which was published slightly later in 1929 in a compilation called Shilpaion, Abanindranath Thakur also writes almost the same thing. He writes that basically this habitual way of looking is like a layer. কাজের, I'm quoting him, কাজের জগতে চলাচল করতে করতে কাজের দৃষ্টি অভ্যস্ত পরকলার মতো চোখের পরে এমন শক্ত হয়ে বসে যায় যে চলতি দেখাশোনা থেকে দৃষ্টিকে, শ্রবণকে যে মুক্তি দিতে হয় শিল্পী হতে গেলে, কবি হতে গেলে, এবং তাদের রচনার মর্ম গ্রহণ করতে হয়, একথা ভুলে বসি আমরা স্বভাবত। So both Rabindranath and Abanindranath are trying to kind of remind us of this extreme importance of paying attention to the looking. Now, it is true that almost all the creative minds and scholars of visual arts have unanimously agreed that the world we inhabit is filled with visual images, both natural and created, and therefore it is needless to say how important is this whole act of looking. But when Rabindranath repeatedly says, as I have already quoted, that একটি মাত্র কথা আলো, কেবল একটি মাত্র কথা প্রতিদিন আমাদের বলছে দেখো, বাস একবার চেয়ে দেখো, which as I have already mentioned, that he wrote these lines in a short article titled Dhaka, Seeing, and later delivered the same as a speech in his regular sermons at the weekly congregations at the Upasana Griho in Shantiniketan during that period, 1908 to 1916. Now, this entire article is about this gift of looking and its immense value in our waking and conscious life, and emphasizing the significance of looking as an essential part of living and cerebral growth. Rabindranath explained that looking as a physical act of observation was highly rewarding, as the world in general and nature in particular was always waiting to be seen. It's waiting to be seen, without which both would remain incomplete in essence. He also wrote that the mere ability to look optically could not ensure that we could visually perceive the visible world meaningfully, because seeing, quote unquote, after all, was a matter of deeper perception, attentiveness, and involvement. In other words, by implication, Rabindranath believed that looking was an indispensable aspect of nurturing a holistic way of life, aspiring to fulfill the needs of our finer sensibilities. And further, he said that eschewing all the calculative tendencies pertaining to material gains and knowledge buildup, unconditional engagement with looking and observing the world around would always enrich the life with a sense of mental fulfillment and completeness. Of course, here Rabindranath was not essentially talking about looking at art, but nevertheless, looking was highly kind of foregrounded in many of his writings as an essential part of upbringing of children. Now, so it was not very surprising that when children were looking at paintings created by Rabindranath Thakur, they were almost kind of sharing the same kind of enchantment. For example, when they were looking at a painting like this, which was apparently not so easy to recognize, looks like a little ambiguous, but for children, it was not ambiguous. Even if it was the ambiguity which they could respond to very easily. So often, for example, in this case, I have found that a group of children in a class would be a little divided. Some would say, well, I can see a man bent, in a very difficult kind of position, seated in a very difficult position with his head bent and all that. Another group would say, no, what I can see is a beautiful prodip, a deep, a lamp. And when I would generally ask, so which would be true? Then after a brief kind of altercations between these two groups, no, it's lamp or it's a man, this and that, then in many occasions, I have, to my great surprise, I have found at least one or two kids who would say that both could be true. Now, this for me was extremely important, that children do recognize the possibility of multiple meanings in a work of art, which was quite in contrast to many adults, many grown-ups, whom I have seen in my own family, amongst my friends, would always ask for one singular meaning. Tell me, what is exactly the meaning of this painting? No, what is, as if there is an anxiety that there has to be one particular meaning. But look at what Rabindranath himself wrote. He wrote that ছবির গোড়াকার কথা হচ্ছে রূপভেদ। আমি একটি গাছকে দেখছি আর দেখি তার ভেতরে একটা human quality. This is what he's exactly saying. I look at a tree and I find a human quality. Now, this is of course written by Abanindranath Thakur, and in fact Abanindranath Thakur recognizes this, and that Rabindranath would, and he loved to kind of imply several meanings, and like Rabindranath, children definitely believed the danger of a single story. So on several occasions, this is something that I have found very significant to study, that children are usually pretty cool and relaxed with this kind of artworks. Now, we do use these words, scribbles, doodles, deletions, rejections, when we explain these very early manuscripts, paintings or drawings by Rabindranath. And, but because I had almost forgotten my school days, and so when one of the Patho Bhavan kids here reminded me that, have you forgotten that in yours, we all do in our class, sometimes we do some scribbles and doodles on our exercise books. So I said, but can you understand what exactly are these forms? And they would say, no, even Rabindranath did not know what exactly he was doing. Even we do not know what exactly we do. Then why you do that? Then I still remember that a girl from class 7 in Patho Bhavan here said that we are, আমরা একটা কিছু খুঁজছি, she said. We're looking for something. We are in search of a form. So when I was showing them these manuscripts by Rabindranath, and this whole process from rejection to recognition, that the ability to recognize forms from apparently very ambiguous kind of patterns and scratches was something extremely easy. Children are usually very, very comfortable with these kind of images, as much as they are with these images as well. So this was at a very early stage of my research. This was a very important finding on my part, that ambiguity, which often creates certain kind of anxiety among adults or grown-ups as far as the meanings of works of art is concerned. But for children, ambiguity, if not anything else, at least a great source of joy, a great source of enjoyment. They really feel entertained to see that there are ambiguities in works of art, that there are multiple meanings in works of art. So all these kinds of paintings, where we might use, and we do use, art historians do use very specific terms, terminologies to explain or kind of to denote, to categorize. But children very easily see the possibilities of multiple forms in singular images. And they love to do that. They find expressions, they find human qualities. They also find the possibilities of looking at or discovering a character from a different planet. This is what exactly one child told me when he was looking at this particular painting. Because when we were discussing the possibility of the expression and who could this person be, he simply said that he doesn't belong to Earth. This guy comes from a different planet altogether. So the explanations and also the descriptions they make, they often cross the boundaries of perhaps the intended meanings of the paintings, and they incorporate their own experiences of reading various stories book or also watching different kind of television serials and all that. Now, I still remember a kind of commotion that erupted in one class in Patwabhan here when they were looking at this particular painting. And as I told you, like it happened in many other occasions, whereas one particular group could quickly recognize this as an old man, but another group was more comfortable to identify this form as a mountain, and then somehow emerges a third group which is happy to incorporate both the possibilities in one single form, and they called it the mountain man. And then I remember that after a couple of sessions like that, we got engaged into a wonderful game. In fact, a very entertaining game, very exciting game, where all the children, they wanted to give name or captions to these paintings. In fact, when they came to know that most of these paintings, Rabindranath himself left most of these paintings untitled. And as he himself said, Rabindranath had, it's quoted in many books, he had said that Roop Srishti Amar Kaj, Nam Brishti Oporit. And I found exactly this is what was happening in my classes when the children were eager to give captions, and trust me that not a single child would be happy to give one single captions. Now, again, I was convinced that as far as Rabindranath Thakur's paintings are concerned, as far as many other paintings are concerned, it is possible, it is highly possible, and it does happen with children, that they're comfortable with this whole idea that a work of art, a form, is not necessary. It is not necessary that it embodies one single meaning or one single story. In fact, when we were having a lot of discussion on this particular painting in one of our sessions, whether it is a stone or it looks like a man or a human being or some other creature, then one girl comes up with a fantastic solution. She says, of course, we can see some impressions of a human being, but again, partly it also looks like a stone. Is it possible that Rabindranath tried to tell us the story of a stone? How a stone became human, or a human became turned into a stone? So the fact that a work of art can encourage children not only to interpret the works of art, but by engaging them with this whole act of looking, they encourage them to think without any inhibition. This is something that I found extremely fascinating. And it happened with all kinds of creatures, landscapes. This I must tell you, this is a wonderful story around this particular painting, which I was showing to the children of Shuchona, as you know. School meant for mainly tribal children in Khanjonpur near Shantiniketan. And when we were having quite a bit of fun when we were looking at this painting, because the children were trying to identify the bird. And I was trying to tell them, like, but don't you see that the legs are pretty odd? They don't look very natural. Even the beak doesn't look very natural. But they challenged my statement by saying that no, this is exactly what happens when a bird turns its head backward. The beak also looks upturned. And then I asked, but what about the legs? Then the kids told me, yes, when the bird or the birds walk very fast, this is how their legs look like. So I realized that, which is something that I have later on probed more deeply, that there is also a possibility. I'm challenging the certain idea of universal response. There is a possibility that the way children respond, let us say the way urban children respond to work of art, there's a possibility that could be very different from the way rural children respond to same works of art. And I did have a few more occasions to almost kind of support my observation here. Now, coming back to bird, we were talking about this bird, and as we know that interpretation of a work of art, it is also about making of meaning. And in this particular case, the children of Patavaman came up with some absolutely very, very surprising and wonderful interpretation when we were trying to understand why did Rabindranath do so much of scratches and marks on the wings, on the body of this particular bird. First of all, children did not have any problem in accepting this as a bird. And because of the wings, the children also told me that possibly this is one of those migratory birds. And in order to justify their observation, I remember clearly that one child told me, we were having this discussion with a group of class 7 children in Patavaman, and he told me that I'm sure this is a migratory bird. And I asked him, why? What makes you so certain about this? He tells me that can't you see the maps on his body? As the migratory bird kept on traversing, flying, traveling from one country to another country, he carried all the maps on his body. I was pretty stunned. I never thought of this kind of interpretation, and interpreting these marks not as only surface rendering or things like that, but he is reading into it something very tangible. That is a map, an atlas, which this guy must have been. I'm sure this boy was looking at maps at that point of time. He was fascinated by that. So this kind of how their experiences in their classroom, outside classrooms, also infiltrate and take part in the making of meaning of these subjects. After all, now I'm convinced, after having gone through hundreds of sessions over last 1 decade, that children believe in, they're fascinated by layers of meanings. They don't go for singular meaning. And once again, let me repeat, they in fact avoid the danger of the single meaning. So despite the fact that most of the children would not know the story around this pair of shoes painted by Van Gogh, within seconds, they wouldn't really take much time to build up a whole story around an image like this. I'm not going into the details, but I'm just sharing a few samples, the kind of images I used to show them, and I still show them, in order to encourage them to make meanings, to interpret. And in fact, children are, as viewers, they're wonderful who can tell all these hidden stories. Now, coming back to, this is the last part of my presentation now. I shall wind up soon. And coming back to Rabindranath, with which I would like to wind up my presentation. One of the most fascinating aspects in general, of course, with Tagore's paintings is hundreds of portraits that he had done and also self-portraits. And children really are fascinated. Every time I have shown these kind of portraits to children, also slightly grown-up children, I have seen how fascinated they are when they look at these portraits, and also how tempted they feel, particularly slightly grown-up children from class 9, 10 onwards, also the students of class 11 and 12, to tell me what exactly this person or this character is all about. I'm not going into the details of all the stories right now, but I would definitely like to share something which was extremely striking for me when I showed them. And remember, these kids also do a lot of masks, a lot of this kind of portraits themselves. So what, like this kind of portraits might appear for some in terms of distortion, exaggeration, and all that. But for children, they are expressions, very prominent, very compelling expressions. In fact, I have not so far found or seen or heard a single child using these terms like stylization or distortion to explain these or to describe these kind of faces or portraits. Now, coming to self-portraits. So, of course, as far as children of a school like Pathu Bhavan is concerned, and many other schools are concerned, they know how Rabindranath looked like in real life. So I was intrigued to know how would they respond to a self-portrait like this, where Rabindranath in these self-portraits do not look the way he did look in real life, right? So often I used to also show the real photograph in order to remind them, look, this is how he looked like, and this is how he is painting himself or drawing himself. Now, I still remember when a very small boy from, we were having this session at Shuchona in Khanjanpur village. He straight away told me that, oh, I know why it happened like this. Why Rabindranath in these self-portraits is not exactly looking the way he should look like. I asked him why. He said, because he did not have a mirror. Onar ghore ayna chilo na. That was, then I was told by their teacher, Rahulda, that actually they did not have a mirror at their home. But this boy had seen mirror somewhere else. So he knew about the mirror, and he was pretty convinced that because Rabindranath did not have a mirror, so it was a kind of mishap. But when I showed similar kind of self-portraits to different groups of children, for example, our own Pathu Bhavan children here, they had very interesting interpretations, explanations to share. For example, I still remember a girl from our Pathu Bhavan. She was in class 10, and she told me that all these self-portraits are deliberately kind of, she didn't exactly use the word distorted, she used something like that. These self-portraits are expressions of his pathos, his pain, onar bedonar prakash. I asked her why. He said because he was going through an extremely sad patch of life during this period. Because she asked me when exactly these portraits were painted, I gave her a rough idea. And she said because of the Second World War and various other things, she explained. And then I asked her, then so these are not portraits, self-portraits. She said, yes, self-portraits where the entire world and Rabindranath's response to that world gets embodied or expressed. And finally, we come to the last slide of my presentation today, where once again, I had a very, very thought-provoking experience with children when I showed this very simple painting by Rabindranath Tagore, and everybody could easily recognize, okay, mother and child, mother and child. Not difficult to identify the form, not difficult to recognize the subject matter, but then I tried to draw the attention to that black space around the figure, mother and child. And of course, children did come up with multiple meanings, possible meanings of that black kind of space immediately around the figure. Could be the entrance to a house, could be some dark background, etc., etc. But I'll never forget what one young girl from class 7 told me. She said, this black space around this figure is the expression of the love, of the empathy. She used the word mamuta, Mayer mamuta, with which this mother is protecting her child. So thank you as of now. And thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you. So this is where my presentation ends at the moment.
Thank you, Soumik da. Would Bipashadi like to say something on this? Or
No, Shudev, carry on.
okay, right. Thank you, Soumik da, for this wonderful presentation, which only you could have pulled it up so brilliantly, keeping in mind the very difficult for the layman approaches to art and how to sort of bring that together to children and talk about their responses to art and our responses to their responses to art. And so I'm sure there are a lot of questions around. In fact, would you like to take the questions from the persons who have asked the questions, or do you want me to read them out from the chat boxes? There are some questions.
Okay, Shudev, I'm also reading out from the chat box.
Okay. Prashanjit Chatterjee want to know children's responded seeing the shoes of Van Gogh.
Okay. Just can I quickly go through all the questions, Shudev?
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, Prashanjit Chatterjee writes, I want to know the story, what children's responded seeing the shoes of Van Gogh. Hem Kushum writes, so as teachers, when or where should one stop and just let them experience, as you mentioned, that it will be wrong to consider them as artists. So exactly what in your view should be taught? Ananda Dr. Gupta, how would you define the category child in your discussion? It is confined to a specific age group, or does it relate to state of the mind or the nature of one's case? When we look at outsider art or primitive art, are we conditioned to look at the childlike, or the child is there? Yeah. Can I begin by responding to Anunda's question? Yes.
Yeah, but Soumik, whichever suits you best. There are basically 3 questions from
I
so
saw
whatever
that.
suits you. Yeah, okay.
Anunda, as far as so far my kind of engagement with this particular area is concerned. I have been looking at child literally, but of course, when I was conducting different sessions and art looking sessions in different schools, I was making certain categories in terms of age groups. The very usual formal age group like the middle school, high school and all that. And yes, when we approach this as a state of mind, of course, that is slightly different, because even if an adult claims that he or she has a state of mind which is childlike, but we can't, I don't know to what extent we can ignore the whole world of the way we are conditioned. Despite the fact maybe with art, in case of art, the way we respond to art could be very close to the state of mind, but not even despite the fact that I'm not a child. I am really not very sure about that. But the nature of one's gaze, I do agree. I myself have come across, more often than not, occasions where I have found a kind of incredible similarity between the way a child responds to a work of art and an adult responds to a work of art. And there I do agree with you, Ananya, that yes, there we see a state of mind, despite the fact that the person is not child anymore. And when we look at outsider art or primitive art, are we conditioned to look at the childlike or the childlike there? Actually, we shouldn't, really speaking, because anthropologically speaking, art historically speaking, that's a very different story altogether. I would like to respond to Hemkushum also. So as teachers, when or where should one stop and just let them express? As you mentioned, that is a very, very tricky thing, Hemkushum. Yeah, I do agree. It's a very tricky thing, because you see, even when I have been doing all these sessions with children, I kind of, there are two things. First of all, I consider myself not as a teacher who is going to teach how to look at art. I look at myself as a facilitator. And in fact, a large part of a very important aspect of this engagement of mine entails how challenged a facilitator feels at every point of time, and how the methodology of going about it gets not only challenged, but very critical situations needs to be resolved then and there, and you really do not have any model to follow more often than not. And how do you go about it? And to what extent you allow the child to express themselves freely, either as artist or as viewer? To what extent I am actually controlling? This is something that has been asked. People have asked me several times in on several occasions and different seminars, because there is an element of suspicion here with regard to the facilitator like me, that in spite of all my claims that I'm trying, and often I do pretend along with the children, when we are looking at a work of art, I pretend that as if I'm also looking at that work of art for the first time in my life. I do all these things to kind of make them feel as free, as uninhibited, as unconditioned as possible. But then, again, the selection of artworks that I have, the sequence in which I'm showing the artworks, all these things have a curatorial involvement. I can't deny that. So yeah, I do not have a very clear-cut answer to this, Hemkushum, I'm sorry, but I know it comes from, because I have spoken to several art teachers all over India, in fact, teaching in different schools all over India, they all have the same answer, that it is a kind of trial and error kind of process, where you sometimes, for example, a very good friend of mine in Shantiniketan, an incredible artist, Manjuri Chakraborty, once told me, when I was telling her many years back, that I really don't want any art teacher instructing, imposing their students to, when they draw or paint, what to draw, particularly with regard to subject matter. I remember once Manjuri told me, but you know, Soumik, sometimes it is important that you provide them with a subject matter. He said, why? But that gives them a sense of security. So what is applicable to some kids may not be so applicable to another child. So here is the kind of, I think we need to look up to the experience of the teachers to decide on that. And Prashanjit, it is, again, I am sorry, I would not like to go into that right now, because that's a long story. Not one child, several of them. A lot of children, they started making up different kinds of stories. Some said they left the shoes. Some said, no, these shoes look like they don't belong to somebody from a well-off family, things like that. And then there was a wonderful, actually, I showed this painting to a group of children who belonged to class 8, and they responded back by writing short stories on this painting of Shoes by Van Gogh, and different child wrote different stories. And one particular story that I remember very clearly was where the child goes on describing this pair of shoes as a pair of independent entities who never belonged to anybody. And at the end of that story, the child wrote that this having no sense of belonging is what made the artist drawn to this pair of shoes and paint them, right? I think something else has come.
Question from Orpita regarding
Orpita, গ্রামে বেড়ে ওঠা
urban
একটি
child.
শিশু এবং শহরে বড় হয়ে ওঠে একটি শিশুদের যেহেতু বৃত্ত আবৃত হয় ভিন্ন বিন্দুকে কেন্দ্র করে, তাদের দেখা বা ছবির বোঝাপড়ার ক্ষেত্রে পার্থক্য হয় কি? হ্যাঁ, অবশ্যই হয়। অনেকগুলি আমার এরকম অভিজ্ঞতা হয়েছে। তার মধ্যে একটি অভিজ্ঞতা ছোট্ট করে এক্ষুনি শেয়ার করতেই পারি। আবার আমি খঞ্জনপুরে গ্রামে ফিরে যাচ্ছি এবং আমি আমাদের পাঠভবনের, যদিও পাঠভবনের ক্ষেত্রে যদিও শান্তিনিকেতনে তার অবস্থান এবং প্রকৃতি দেখতে দেখতেই পাঠভবনে বড় হয়, তবুও বোধহয় একটা নাগরিক জীবনের সঙ্গে যে যোগটা আছে সেটা নিশ্চিতভাবে খঞ্জনপুরের ওই গ্রামের বাচ্চাদের থেকে তো তুলনামূলকভাবে বেশি। ফলে রবীন্দ্রনাথের যখন আমি ল্যান্ডস্কেপ পেইন্টিংগুলো, নিসর্গ চিত্রগুলো দেখাচ্ছিলাম, তখন এই পাঠভবনের হোক, কলকাতার পাঠভবনের হোক, অন্য কোনো শহরের, কলকাতার অন্য কোনো স্কুলের বাচ্চাদের ক্ষেত্রে হোক, তারা রবীন্দ্রনাথের ল্যান্ডস্কেপে যে রহস্যময়তা আছে, যে সেন্স অফ মিস্ট্রি আছে, সেইটাতে যেমন বেশিরভাগ শহুরে বা নাগরিক মনস্ক বাচ্চারা এইভাবেই সাড়া দিয়েছে যে হ্যাঁ, খুব মিস্টিরিয়াস, খুব রহস্যময়। যেমন আমার মনে আছে আমাদেরই শান্তিনিকেতনের পাঠভবনের একটি বাচ্চা বলেছিল, মনে হয় এখনই কোনো একটা অ্যাডভেঞ্চার, মনে হচ্ছে স্পষ্ট করে অ্যাডভেঞ্চার শব্দটি ইংরেজিতে ব্যবহার করেছিল, একটা অ্যাডভেঞ্চার ঘটতে চলেছে। একজন বলেছিল মনে হচ্ছে একটা ডিটেকটিভ গল্পের মতো, ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি। অথচ এই খঞ্জনপুরের বাচ্চাদের ক্ষেত্রে আমার মনে আছে যে একাধিক বাচ্চা যেটা বলেছিল যে এ তো আমাদের ক্যানালপাড়ের ছবি, হ্যাঁ এ তো ওইখানের ছবি, হ্যাঁ এ তো কোপায়ের ধারের ছবি। তখন আমি বলেছিলাম যে একদম চিনতে পারছো, এখানকারই ছবি? ওরা বলেছিল হ্যাঁ এখানকার ছবি। তো ততক্ষণে ওরা জেনে গেছিল কার আঁকা। আমি সবসময় শুরুতেও বলতাম না, একটু পরে হয়তো বলতাম, কারণ ওরা রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুরের কিছু কবিতা রাহুলদা পড়িয়েছিলেন, ফলে ওরা জানে, রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুরের নামও জানে, রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুরের সম্পর্কে জানে। তাহলে রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুরের আঁকা তো, তিনি তো শান্তিনিকেতনে থাকতেন, তো উনি কি ওখান থেকে বসে বসে এঁকেছেন? বলছে না না, উনি তো এখানে আসতেন। রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর এখানে আসতেন, এখানে এসে ক্যানাল পাড়ে বসে এই ছবিগুলো আঁকতেন। অত্যন্ত বিশ্বাসের সঙ্গে এই কথাগুলো বলেছিল এবং আমি খুব সিরিয়াসলি নিয়েছিলাম, কারণ যেই ল্যান্ডস্কেপ নাগরিক মনস্ক বাচ্চাদের মনে হচ্ছিল রহস্যময়তায় ভরা, সেই একই ল্যান্ডস্কেপ পেইন্টিং খঞ্জনপুর গ্রামের বাচ্চাদের মনে হয়েছিল খুব স্বাভাবিক, কারণ এই আলো ছায়া, এই টুয়ালাইট, এই ডাস্ক ডন, এই টুয়ালাইট জোনে আঁকা ওই বিচিত্র ওই আলোর খেলা ওরা কিন্তু প্রতিনিয়তই দেখতে পায়। ফলে এটা আমি একটা উদাহরণ দিলাম, এরকম অনেক উদাহরণ, যেমন আয়না ছিল না ইত্যাদি, অনেক রকম উদাহরণ আমি পেয়েছি।
ধন্যবাদ সৌমিক।
Soumik, there is one more question from Srijoni Dotto. You have mentioned that the child's yes
Gaze is multi-layered. They don't go for a single monolithic interpretation as opposed to that. Is there any particular reason? I am sure there are many reasons, not any particular reason. But as far as art response is concerned, one thing I've clearly observed, that children go gaga over multiple meanings, because that enables them to, that retains their joy of looking at art, as opposed to many adults who think that the act of looking is over once the meaning is derived or deciphered. So they keep deciphering, not only deciphering, they keep probing as far as children are concerned. As far as adults are concerned, meaning is deciphered, meaning is known, and then looking is over. Go to the next work. This doesn't happen. Once children fall in love with a particular painting, they want to, usually this is what I've seen, they want to keep looking at that painting. And to retain that interest, they keep making up, I must also say. It's not that they genuinely say what they feel or genuinely feel what they say. Often they start making up and then they become uncontrollable.
Right. Thank you, Soumik. Any more questions? Would somebody like to actually ask a question? Come in. Any more questions? If there are no more questions, then may I ask a question, Soumik, if it is okay with you?
Please, Shudev.
Okay, this is regarding our mutual love for the comics, graphic novels, graphic narratives. I was just wondering, that's very interesting, because maybe the graphic narrative is something that in its end product is something that is approached by both the child and the adult at the same time. So the Tintin that the child is reading right now is also the Tintin that an adult person is reading. And in many cases, the child who had read the Tintin when he or she was 10, 12 is also an adult person who might actually come back and revisit the Tintin. I'm just using an example. It could be anything. It could be Hada Boda. It could be any other thing. So what is your response to this? I mean, how do children approach the comics, and in what way do we approach the comics? Is there an essential difference? Are we talking about essentialization of the child's gaze and the adult's gaze?
Yeah, Shudev. As far as I have observed, I have seen that when children read comics, they are prone to, and they do that more often than not, they associate the stories, be it Tintin or Asterix or Hada Boda, anything. This is something that you must have also done, I have also done, to a larger world. But I remember that I used to imagine, and I also started drawing Hada Boda, Batul the Great, seated in my own drawing room in my home. And I also, I started kind of almost having hallucinations, where I could see, because Batul the Great was one of my favorite characters as far as Bangla comic strip is concerned. And I remember that it was not only me, many of my classmates would love to imagine having Batul the Great as a team member in our soccer team, football team, and all that. So what I'm trying to say, the way children expand the narrative and bring the narrative to our home, to our own, spaces. This is something that usually an adult would not do. Adult would generally, I have seen, in fact, when I myself read the same Tintin, same comic strips later when I grew up, I was more keen on getting the context right. Right, Shudev? This is exactly what I have to say right now. Whereas children,
Thank
they
you,
don't
Soumik.
care about the exact original context. They keep expanding the narrative in every possible way. This is what I have to say. As of
Right.
now.
Thank you, Soumik. Would there be a last question maybe from somebody? Would somebody like to ask, or should we? Vipashadi, would you like to ask, or should we bring this
No,
session to a close?
am I audible? Thank you, Soumik. It was a wonderful lecture.
Thank you,
I
Vipashadi.
enjoyed it greatly. Shudev, I think if there are no more questions, we could end with a formal vote of thanks.
Right. Thank you, Vipashadi. So if there are no more questions, thank you, Soumikda, for being
Thank you.
with us, for sort of giving us your valuable, very professional insiders and outsiders input to both art and children's psychology and attitude to the adults on the responses of the child to art and the art to child. It's a very, very fluid concept. And we really enjoyed your presentations, your approach, actually using real life, real time people as children from Konjonpur, from Patho Bhavan, both Patho Bhavan in the sense of Shantiniketan and the concept of the children. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Soumik Nandy Majumdar from the Department of History of Art on retelling art through the eyes of children. This was the second lecture of the Dialogic Visva-Bharati Young Scholars lecture series. And we plan to have one more, if not two, in the future. Maybe in March, sometime middle of March. We'll let that know on the usual platform. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again at the next edition of Dialogue. Thank you once again.
Thank you, everybody.
So Kaushik, thank you. Can we bring this to a close?
Sure.
Right. Thank you again.
Sure.
Thank you.